Welcome to the Kaplan Coaching Podcast, where it's all about turning your job search into a slam dunk. Your host is Angela Kaplan.
Welcome to the Kaplan Coaching Podcast. I'm your host, Angela Copeland. Live on the phone with me today, I have Linda Kaplan Thaler in New York City. Linda is responsible for some of America's most famous advertising campaigns in the industry, including the Aflac Duck and the daring Yes, Yes, Yes campaign for herbal essences. Much of her work has become part of America's pop culture landscape, and she's composed some renowned jingles such as I'm a Toys R Us Kid and Kodak Moments. Linda is the chairman of Publicis New York, with a client roster that includes P&G, Citi, L'Oreal, Pfizer, and Wendy's. Linda's talents have earned her the prestigious Matrix Award, the Muse Award, Advertising Woman of the Year Award, and she was named one of Advertising Age's most influential women in advertising. Most recently, Linda was inducted into the 2015 Advertising Hall of Fame. Most recently, Linda was inducted into the 2015 Advertising Hall of Fame. Along with Robin Koval, she co-authored the national best-selling book, Grit to Great: How Perseverance, Passion, and Pluck Take You from Ordinary to Extraordinary. Linda, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you.
Well, I mentioned to you before we got started, I am so excited to talk with you about your new book and the concept of grit as an idea. So for our listeners who may not be familiar with grit, can you share with us a little bit about what it means to you?
Well, what it means to me as Robin Koval, my co-author, and the person who started our company together, the advertising agency, the Kaplan Thaler Group, so we started several years ago. We are two gals from the Bronx that we didn't have any money. We had public education upbringings, and for us, starting an agency, we were already in our mid-40s. We had been in the agency business for a long time. The idea of two women in the middle 40s starting an ad agency was like never going to happen. We were the underdogs of all time. But we did it nevertheless, and as we started winning more and more businesses, we realized it wasn't talent alone, it wasn't intelligence, because we had that, but not to the uber point of being brilliant. We realized that we kept winning accounts because we worked harder than everybody else, and it was that Bronx underdog mentality that kind of did it. And then we started looking at other people, like uber successful people. Colin Powell was a C- student in college, and Michael Jordan didn't make his high school varsity basketball team. And Thomas Edison was told he was too stupid to learn anything, that maybe he should be homeschooled. All these people, Steven Spielberg, he was rejected from film school 3 times. Mm-hmm. All these people didn't possess the it factor. They were so ordinary growing up. They weren't brilliant. They didn't have incredible talents. They did have what we call the grit factor, and we define grit as an acronym. I mean, we're advertising people, so we like to make things easy for people to remember. We are the company that created the Aflac Duck, so we're kind of good at that. And we think of grit as having 4 components: GRIT, guts, resilience, initiative, and tenacity. And if you have those 4 things, and you don't have to be born with them, and our book shows you how to develop it, there's really no telling how far you can go. And actually, the new research that's just come out, which is incredible, said that 98% of the most successful people in the world do not have the it factor, but they all have what we call the grit factor. And that is the reason that they're successful.
Absolutely. So how long have you been kind of studying this concept of grit? Like, how long have you been sort of dialed into it?
Years. It's a very short book because we've written several other books, The Power of Nice, The Power of Small. We like to write short books, but we take a long time. This one was a few years in the making. It actually takes a long time to write a short book because you want to condense it in a way that makes it very digestible for people who have incredibly busy lives, and we're very respectful of their time. We want the interviews to be as emotional, as insightful as possible. And we also want to make sure that there's a lot of learning in between the pages. So it took a long time. We gathered a lot of research. We did a lot of research ourselves. We created a grit quiz. And if you go on to grittogreat.com, over 10,000 people have taken this quiz, and it'll give you an idea of what your strong and weak points are. And I think people have benefited from the quiz and from the book, and also in terms of parents now buying it for their kids. We're thrilled. CNN did a huge piece on our book about how parents can teach their kids grit, and it catapulted us to the bestseller list. So we're thrilled that the book has made such an amazing impact, not just for people who are business people, entrepreneurs, or people starting new careers, but also for the high school and even middle school and college community. And the book is now being marketed for college students everywhere.
Oh, that's awesome.
We're very excited about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so speaking of your book, there's a quote, and I want to just say it for our listeners. You said, the end game, it turns out, belongs to the truly diligent, not the merely talented. It belongs to those who have grit. And you mentioned some of the people, like Steve Jobs, Colin Powell, Michael Jordan, and I think so often when we see those people, by the time we know who they are very successful, and we assume they did have some kind of an it factor. Can you talk a little more about, the thing that you feel like made the difference for those people? What kind of tipped them over the edge to actually become successful?
Well, it was the amount of perseverance and stamina, and also the passion that they had for something. In the case of Colin Powell, he was a very mediocre student, and it wasn't until the ROTC came on campus at City College. We both went to the same humble public university at in New York, City College in New York. And once he discovered the ROTC, he realized something greater than himself would give him the passion and perseverance to excel. And that passion was to serve his country. And one of the things he realized, and we realized in our research, is that you can go much further if your reasons for doing something are intrinsic rather than extrinsic. Mm-hmm. In other words, you're not becoming an actor because you want to win an Oscar and you want to be famous and wear, pretty outfits on the red carpet. You have a better chance of becoming a well-known actor if you enjoy the idea of taking on roles, of personas, of studying the craft, and wanting to bring out something in your audience and in yourself. So those intrinsic things are really, really, really important. For me in advertising, and I'm sure for Robin as well, part of it was, wow, I can do something that actually motivates people to do something that in many ways is very positive. When I advertised Kodak and we helped create Kodak Moments, well, people were able to document all, the growing up of their families and their babies and elderly people that one day might not be around. It's all documented now. And I like to think our advertising really pushed people to take more pictures the same way we do advertising for the Anti-Defamation League and for the Ad Council, and Robin is doing extraordinary work now for the Legacy Foundation, or now called the Truth Initiative, which does all of that brilliant anti-smoking advertising. So there has to be something in it that you feel very proud about while you're doing, and that makes the work a lot easier, right? It makes it much easier to accomplish. And we give a lot of tips in the book, a lot of grit builders, especially for people who are looking at new careers. Very, very simple things you can do to train your brain to stay more focused. We're a society that's become very enamored of quick fixes, right? We're sort of an ADD culture, and we get distracted, and everything seems so simple. Nobody sees behind the curtain. We look at a YouTube sensation. We think the person got there overnight. It could be that person probably did 100 or 200 videos before anything got recognized. We watch The Biggest Loser, and we see a guy lose 40 pounds between commercial breaks, and yet we don't realize we're not reading the small print that says it took him 1.5 years of diet and exercise and sweat equity to get there. This stuff is really hard. Beverly Sills, one of the greatest opera singers of the 20th century, said there are no shortcuts to anywhere worth going. And I couldn't agree more, especially for millennials. There's this mad rush to make it by the time they're 30 because that's the hype that's being dished out by the media. You know, you've got to be a millionaire. You've got to create that app before you're 25 or 26. You know what? Most of the great inventions are happening in Silicon Valley with people in their 40s and 50s. There is no rush towards greatness. It takes years often, and that's okay because the fastest growing segment in the world today are centenarians, are people in their hundreds. And millennials will probably be in their 120s or 130s, and I go, what's your rush? You know, life is not a sprint, it's a marathon. Enjoy it. And you'll probably have 2 or 3 or maybe 4 different careers. The idea of people having one career is ridiculous nowadays. And I just want to encourage people, especially people who are just starting out, there isn't a hurry towards greatness of what you want to achieve. Take the time to do it right.
You know, so the other thing, too, that kind of comes up when we talk about it factor is often I think people assume that it's the folks that have a very high IQ, like those who are in Mensa, for example, who maybe are the most successful. But I think I recently saw, and I don't know if I saw it on your website or somewhere else, that the number of people who have a Mensa level intelligence who perform to their full capabilities in this way, it's actually relatively low. So those people who are achieving seems to be they're not that different, other than the grit part of the whole equation.
You're absolutely right. We mentioned it in the book, but I have to say, since the book's come out, there has been so much more research about the importance of grit and the relatively unimportance of having a genius or a Mensa IQ. In fact, some of the research is actually showing that people who are prodigies, you know, someone who has an IQ of 100, over 170 or 180, only 2% of prodigies ever do anything successful in their lives. That's a really small percentage. And trying to give a reason for that, a rationale for that, some are speculating that, and researchers actually are speculating, that what happens when you're born with this innate brilliance or innate virtuoso talent. Yes, some people go on and they do amazing things. But for most of them, the journey is relatively easy. There are not that many challenges until there are. You know what I mean? Until they get into college and there's a roadblock, until they're doing the dissertation, until they're trying to find an invention for something in their 20s. And the tendency is very often for those people to give up, because they're not used to challenges and difficulties. Yet a disproportionate amount of people who have had challenges early in life tend to become very successful. We talk about, one of our clients is Wendy's, you know, the hamburger franchise, and the founder is Dave Thomas. We researched, because one of our accounts, we talked a lot to his daughter, Wendy Thomas, who, of course, he named the restaurant chain after her. And she told us so much about Dave and his upbringing. He had a very difficult upbringing. He had an adoptive mother who passed away. He had a father who traveled a lot. He was extremely poor. He didn't get past a 10th grade education. He had it really tough. And as a result, he knew how to work unbelievably hard from the time he was about 13 years old. And his grandma Minnie, his adopted grandma, said to him, hard work is good for the soul, and whatever you do it with quality. Remember, never cut corners. Well, the next time you go to a Wendy's restaurant, I hope you do, because they make the best hamburgers in the world, you will notice that they are square. And the reason they're square is because his grandmother told him to never cut corners. And so that was his way of honoring her. And also this attention to quality. If you're going to do something, you do it right. And we love the story of Dave Thomas, because Wendy said, you know, my dad he made his millions pretty early in life. He could have stopped right there, but he created the Wendy's chain, not so that his kids would never have to work, but that his kids would always know how to work. And that where other parents may have instilled that what work takes out of you, she said, my dad taught me what work instills in you. And there is a sense of happiness. And in our research, we found this whole notion of retirement, it's crazy. Yes, you may want to, quote unquote, retire from a job that you don't like when you're 65, but to stop doing something, to stop exercising your brain, and it doesn't make you happier. As a matter of fact, in our research, because we say grit has no expiration date, we actually found that people get very depressed when they're doing nothing. And your brain activity, contrary to what people think, that, as you get older, your brain activity decreases, it's not true. Your brain activity decreases if you stop using your friggin' brain. Now, happiness actually is not the absence of problems. Happiness is how your brain feels when it solves problems.
Right.
And that's why we love doing things. We love crossword puzzles. We love brain twisters. We love to figure out the end of a James Patterson novel. By the way, he was my boss for 18 years. A great example of grit, the #1 best-selling author in the world today, who, when I worked for him, he was my, creative director in an ad agency. And he worked for 17 years on trying to create a best-selling novel and had many other novels before that weren't bestsellers. But not only did he work hard, but here's a guy that woke up at 4 a.m. every morning, 7 days a week, wrote for 4 or 5 hours, showered, got dressed, and came into work and put a full day of work at an ad agency, which is hard stuff.
Yes.
He did this for 21 years. Can you imagine? 4 a.m. every day for 21 years. And when he was in early 40s, I'm on a plane with him going to a Kodak meeting, and he had a pad in his hand, and he said, you know what? I just figured out how to write a bestseller. I've created this character called Alex Cross. I'm going to have short chapters. I'm going to have twists at the end. And he gave me the whole formula. And his first novel was Along Came a Spider, and it became a bestseller. So this notion that somebody like him was like an overnight success, 21 years. And I turn to people and I go, it's going to take time, and it's going to take a lot of work, and enjoy it, because failure is part of it. James Dyson, we talk about in the book. I love James Dyson. The guy who invented the bagless vacuum cleaner?
Right.
You see an incredible invention? You know what we found in our research? He worked on this for 15 years.
Wow.
And he had 1,526 prototype vacuum cleaners that totally sucked. Or, as I usually say, they didn't suck. They didn't suck, and that was the problem. And he said each failure was a blessing, because it got me closer and closer to this revolutionary product that I created. I never thought when I started I would end up going this far. And so failure, let's embrace it. Let's rejoice, because it's helping you get to where you're supposed to be.
Yeah. It teaches you something. And I think the thing, though, the point to all of this, right, is it's that grit that keeps you moving forward. When you were talking a little bit about the fact that having the challenging upbringing earlier in life actually can help you, because you learn to keep going and you learn to persevere, the hair on my arms was actually standing up, because I relate to that so much. And I do think it's interesting, because I will meet people sometimes who had a very pleasant life, or whose parents achieved a lot and made a very comfortable life for them, and they don't have that fire all the time. And they do get very discouraged when they first hit a road bump for the first time in their life. So I find that to be really interesting.
It really is true. Somebody wrote a book, and I don't think I'm quoting correctly, was the disadvantaged of being advantaged. Hard knocks are good. As a matter of fact, we found that people who were dyslexic, a disproportionate amount of them become very successful, because they've had to accomplish something so difficult early in life that a lot of stuff feels like gravy. When they get older, they go, "Wow, that's not so bad. That's not like having to learn how to read when nobody, when nobody thought they could teach me." So and the way we compensate is so great. We had so many great interviews in the book. We interviewed Haskell Wexler, who's Academy Award-winning cinematographer, and the reason we interviewed him is because he's colorblind, and we thought, why would you become a cinematographer if you had this disability? And he thought we were crazy. He said, disability? By being colorblind, I can see gradations of black and white that people who see color can't even envision. And as a result, when we have a scene, especially or the lighting is tricky, or we have people of different cultures, African American or Asian. He said, I can light everybody in the same scene because I can see things that they can't. He said, so I he turned the telescope around, and for us, it was such an eye-opener, no pun intended,
right?
That, wow, we all can take something we think is a negative point about ourselves, and we can turn it around and say, wow, maybe that's a plus. We interviewed this one woman. It was one of the most emotional story in the book for us, who was schizophrenic. She was diagnosed when she just started college, and she couldn't stop hearing these very loud, tormenting voices. And she had years of, it was unbearable, in institutions and medication and electroshock, you name it. And finally, we call it bending like bamboo, she had to adapt to the fact that she wasn't going to stop hearing voices. And the psychiatrist said to her, okay, you know what? They're always going to be here, so you might as well learn to make friends with them. So she actually started having conversations with them, understood their pain. If they would say to her, don't go out of the house for 3 days, instead of trying to push them away, she said, all right, I guess you're really scared. Let's talk about why you're scared. She became so friendly with these voices. They calmed down. They never went away. She went back to school. She got her PhD in psychology. She's a renowned speaker, actually, for the Hearing Voices Society. They don't call them schizophrenics. They call them Hearing Voices Society. And what she tells these 6 million people who have this is, you have not a disability, but a rare sixth sense, a rare gift. Your job is going to be how to harness it. Right. And she said, and I always get chills when I tell this story, she said, once you realize that, you see things from a completely different perspective. And I just found it very enlightening, because we all complain about this is wrong, that is wrong. And I go, if Eleanor, that's her name, if Eleanor Longden can adapt and actually create a strength out of hearing voices, surely you can figure out a way to get over your particular roadblock, right?
No, absolutely. And I think so often when we have a learning disability of some kind, even though we may be weak in one area, it often makes us stronger in another area, just like you mentioned in your examples. And it also makes us more creative about finding solutions, because we don't assume that the thing that works for everyone else will work for us. So you have to really learn to find your way around obstacles. And I think that also ties back to grit and not sort of giving up.
Absolutely.
Well, so in your book,
No, go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, in your book, you also talk about dreamers versus plotters, and I really appreciated that. I would love it if you could share a little bit about the difference between those folks who are dreaming and those folks who are plotting.
Yeah, it's very interesting. We have a chapter called Ditch the Dream, and it's, I know it feels counterintuitive, and like, what is that about? Isn't it good to have a dream? Yeah, it's good to have a goal, okay? A goal is good. A dream, kind of, if you spend your time dreaming, and there's a lot of books out there about dream your way to success, dream it and you'll get it. It's completely not true. Estee Lauder once said, I never once dreamt my way to success. I just work for it. And there's a Yiddish proverb that I love that says, if you want your dreams to become a reality, so wake up already. So here's the problem with dreaming. With dreaming, everything's perfect. We've won the race, we got a Pulitzer, no wonder we want to hit the snooze button and stay in dreamland a little longer. But it doesn't put you in the now, and it doesn't help you solve problems. And if you're always thinking about a perfection that you're going to achieve someday, it never answers the everyday gritty things that need to be solved to get you there. So they did this great research study with graduates from NYU, and they put one group was called the Dreamers, and these were the people who had these incredible aspirations. I'm going to win a Pulitzer Prize. I'm going to be on Broadway. And then the other group they called the plotters. And the plotters, P-L-O-D-D-E-E-R-E-R-S, not the plotters. That I would say for the James Patterson novels, the plotters. But for the plotters, the people who were slugging it out, or as somebody once said to me, climbing up Everest with a toothpick, those people were, this is what they said, okay, tomorrow I'm going to start redoing my resume. I may have to take an online course because I think I want to do something in marketing. I got to think about, should I try for an internship? So that's where they were. They weren't thinking about the ultimate dream. They were thinking about what they had to do that day. And they followed them for several years, these two groups. And the dreamers at the end of that time period virtually went nowhere. Their heads were still in the clouds.
Mm-hmm.
The plotters were actually on their way to become very successful because they stayed, and we love the idea of staying in the here and now, and it's how we built our agency. We started our agency with one business that was that herbal essences. Do you remember that woman in the shower?
Oh, yes, I absolutely do.
Having way too much fun. Yes. We started that one piece of business, and then we got the Affleck account, and then we got some other accounts. And we never worried about what our agency was going to become or being the biggest or being the best. We started off on the third floor of my husband and I had a brownstone, and I wanted to be near my little kids. My kids are now in their 20s. And we never thought about the years from now. We just thought about what we needed to do that day. And within 2 years, we were one of the fastest growing agencies in the United States. Today, we've merged with Publicis to be in Publicis, New York. We have 800 people. We have billions of dollars in billings. And we grew our company simply by dint of the fact that we outworked everybody, and we spent no time imagining and all our time doing.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I love that. That's amazing. It's such a good lesson for all of our listeners. Well, another thing that you talk about often is actually embracing boredom, which I think is a concept that a lot of people would find to be counterintuitive. I really like it. I appreciate it a lot. Can you talk a little bit about the positives that actually come from embracing boredom?
Yeah, we're a culture, an ADD culture, that never wants to be bored for a second. And as a result, we, and I include kids as well, need to be constantly entertained and distracted. Neil Postman, a brilliant media expert, wrote years ago, he wrote a book called We're Amusing Ourselves to Death. And what happens is that, we have to be constantly amused and distracted and entertained. And as a result, we don't let our minds just sort of veg out. Mm-hmm. I think that's why so many people now are so into meditation, because it does allow you to do it free float.
Right.
And one of the things about being bored is that the mind does not like a vacuum. Mm-hmm. And when you are bored, your brain is always going to keep filling up with thoughts. If you don't allow yourself to be bored or daydream, and I always encourage people, take a walk once or twice a day and don't think about anything. Your mind fills up that vacuum, and what happens is you start making very interesting connections in the brain. When we work every day, we do the same thing, and we're always occupying our brain with tasks, mm-hmm. then the synapses are connecting in the same way, and sometimes it's very hard to be creative. Well, one of the reasons, people get so creative in the shower is because their minds are wandering. They've got hot water on the brain, which is increasing the blood flow, mm-hmm. and you ideate better. And so we encourage people and encourage kids to not always be structured, to have that downtime, to just sort of think. There was a great article in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago about Albert Einstein, mm-hmm. and he said he worked in the patent office. It was very hard for Jews to get jobs mm-hmm. at that period, in the 1920s, 1930s. Mm-hmm. And so he got this job in the patent office, and he was very bored, extremely bored, and did a lot of daydreaming. And he said, if it wasn't for this incredibly boring job, I never would have developed my idea for the theory of relativity. Because I had a lot of time in my brain to do nothing and just sort of think. Mm-hmm. And I just love that story, because he said, if I was structured and I was thinking all the time about something else, I might not have had time to come up with that. Now, I'm not saying that our children will necessarily come up with, fusion,
right,
or world peace, but we do need to allow ourselves to be bored more often. And it's interesting, one of the educators that we spoke to, one great thing about working 3 years on a book is you do get a chance to talk to some extraordinary people.
Right.
She's an Icelandic educator. Mm-hmm. And she teaches kindergartners to be bored. She makes them do an activity. They can pick any activity they want, and she gives them a choice. So let's say little boys, decide they want to learn how to knit.
Okay.
Well, you can do that activity, but you've got to do it for a half hour straight. Now, imagine a bunch of 5-year-old boys having to knit for a half hour.
Ooh.
Purl, stitch, right? So they start to cry after about 5 to, I don't want to do this. Well, they say it in Icelandic, so I can't do that accent. I don't want to do this. But they have to do it. And they finish up with a row or whatever they've accomplished, and after the half hour is up, they get big applause, and she says to them, good for you. You learn how to be bored. It's good to be bored. When you grow up, you're going to be plenty bored. But look what you were able to do. And so she applauds their resilience. She applauds the fact that they sat through something they did that was tedious. And she said, we don't do this enough for our kids. We had a wonderful interview with Kelly Wallace on CNN.com in the parenting section, which actually was so popular it popped off onto the homepage of CNN.
Oh, that's awesome.
And it was all about how to teach your kids grit. And one of the things was let your kids be bored. They will get much more creative if you don't, occupy every second. The other thing that we read in our research, and this comes from a Navy SEAL, not just for kids but for adults, is make your bed every morning.
Okay.
Why is this so important? And I always laugh because I never understood why I always have to make my bed every morning, which is awkward because my husband is often still sleeping in it. And he wakes up and he's a human burrito, but that's beside the point. I never understood why I always felt so good. And then this Navy SEAL told us why, and he said, when you or your children make their bed every morning, you leave the house having already accomplished something, right?
Yes.
He said, you haven't even started your day, and you have this accomplishment, this beautifully made bed. And no matter what happens during the day, you have this welcoming, beautifully made bed to come home to. He said the other thing it's great is it teaches you to do something small perfectly and expertly. And you cannot tackle the big things, and this is why it's so important for Navy SEALs, the big things that need to get done until you can tackle the really small things. And so one of the things we talk about in the book is people just don't finish what they start. Make your bed from start to finish. Decide, just as an exercise, decide today when you get home, you're going to clean out that kitchen drawer that's been a mess or straighten out your closet. You get such a great feeling. The endorphins really kick in when you have that feeling of accomplishment. You're going to end up having a better day at work because you're going to get into that mode of, I finished something. Let me finish something else. And it gets very contagious and very addictive. I start off my day, every day, an hour every day, on the treadmill.
Okay.
Come rain or come shine, that's what I do. I get those endorphins kicking. I just read an article today in the paper that said, and I hope it works for me, that people are more mentally alert as they get older when they're in better physical shape.
Right.
And I think that needs to start young, but you can do it. The great thing about grit, of course, is you can learn it when you're 8. You can learn it when you're 88.
Well, so speaking...
There's no topper on it.
Yeah, absolutely. Speaking of age, you mentioned at the beginning of our conversation something I really love, which you talk about sort of removing time restrictions and realizing that you can achieve things throughout your life. Can you give us some sort of, I guess, words of encouragement, given that, our society tends to tell us we need to achieve everything very soon, like you said, by the time you're 30?
Yeah, I really discourage people from getting discouraged. And I mostly see this in millennials who, rush from job to job. They don't give things a chance very often. And there's kind of this, part of the problem was the self-esteem movement. And a lot of millennials were brought up in the self-esteem movement. And as a parent, I felt I'm guiltily part of that movement because, when I grew up, there were winners and losers, and if you got 98 on a test, that was nice, but make sure you get 100 next time. You were really pushed. And I think a lot of kids in generation afterwards, yes, were really pushed. However, the self-esteem movement, which is started by a group of psychologists who said that we need to do better for our children. We need to praise them constantly.
Mm-hmm.
We can never let them feel like they're losers. We can't let them fall. We certainly can't let them fail. And what happened is, in scholastic teams across the country, the whole idea of winners and losers went by the wayside. Everybody got a trophy.
Mm-hmm.
Even if you were in ninth place. I remember my daughter was an equestrian, and, she got seventh place once. And even kids understand that seventh place is not that great.
Right.
But everybody applauded. As a matter of fact, somebody told us recently that they went to a birthday party for kids, and somebody suggested that they play musical chairs, and it was immediately outvoted by the other parents.
Oh.
The reason being, in musical chairs, only one person wins. It's a series of people losing until the end.
Okay.
Well, you know what? I got news for everybody. When all these kids, when they get into the job market, they're going to be very sadly disappointed.
Mm-hmm.
Because certainly in advertising, not only are there no ninth place trophies, there's no silver trophy. Okay,
right.
There's no silver ribbon. You either won the account or you lost it.
That's right.
And that is life.
Mm-hmm.
And it's good to learn those things early on. My son has been a competitive chess player since he's 4 years old. As a matter of fact, he was the kindergarten chess champion in the United States when he was 5. And he learned very early on from some very tough Russian coaches that it was okay if you were upset. It was okay if you lost.
Mm-hmm.
That was a lesson that you need to work harder on your openings or your middle game or your strategy. So he learned that very early on, and I think the pendulum, fortunately, is starting to swing the other way. I think that's why the book, which I'm so happy is doing well, is because I think it's hitting a nerve with people everywhere, which is enough of this already. We have to tell our kids that they're not very special. That when they get out there, they're going to find that as smart as they think there are 10,000 people smarter than they are.
That's right.
But the good news is, because they're smarter, doesn't mean they're going to be more successful. As a matter of fact, or that it matters that much whether you go to an Ivy League school. They just released a study. The Economist just did a college ranking. Did you read about this? And it looked at the top 20 universities in terms of salaries. After graduation. There's only one school in those 20 top schools that's an Ivy League school. That would be Harvard. Most of those schools I never heard of, and yet that's where a lot of the successful people are coming from. And these are people who didn't have the A average, who didn't have the perfect SAT scores. They worked their tails off to get where they are. And, this is what America is built on. Grit, right? That's how we got through the Great Depression and 2 world wars. And we have to harness that, and we have to make it stronger than ever. And I hope what the book does is give people the tools to be able to do that.
Yes, absolutely. Well, this has been fantastic. We've covered such a broad number of different topics. Is there any other advice that you'd like to leave with our listeners today?
Just that be inspired to know that some of the greatest people that you've ever heard of have pretty average IQs and aren't exceptionally talented. They work for it, and they can too, and that I don't think there's a better way to pass it on than to give the gift of grit to your coworkers, to people you love. The book is available anywhere. iBook, there's an audio version as well.
Oh, great.
Go on to grit.com if you want to take the test. We've had over 10,000 people, I think I mentioned before, take this quiz already. And join the conversation. And my Twitter handle is Linda Thaler 2. And easy to find me on Facebook. And love to hear from folks. And stay gritty.
Yes. Well, thank you so much, Linda. This has been awesome.
Oh, I do want to mention one more thing. That Ariana Huffington loved the book so much. She recommended it as one of her top gifts for the holidays. So,
that's
and Ariana's
great.
a gritty lady. She knows. Yes.
Absolutely. That's great. Well, thank you. Thanks, everyone, for listening. Tune in next week for another edition of the Kaplan Coaching Podcast. And if you haven't already, please be sure to subscribe on iTunes or Stitcher to ensure you never miss an episode.
Thank you for listening to the Copeland Coaching Podcast today with your host, Angela Copeland. Tune in next time to get more great tips on turning your job search into a slam dunk.